we're now looking up at a very small window that sits above the balcony at the back of the chapel. So in a way, it's probably a window that an awful lot of people who've come and gone in the chapel have barely noticed. And it is exquisite. It's two angelic figures with amazing, gorgeous wings of sort of fiery feathers, so it maybe even echoes some of the other things we're seeing. And they are described in the book that describes the creation of these windows. The two small lights in the gable above the gallery symbolize law and love in the dispensation of the Old Testament and that of the New Testament, and thus indicate the transition from the scriptural subjects on one side of the chapel, where we've had Old Testament stories, to those that we're now going to look at, which are the New Testament stories. And one is holding a scroll, which is meant to represent law in Old Testament, and one is holding a chalice, and that's meant to represent the sacrifice of Christ and therefore the covenant of love. And it's a way of creating really quite a stark distinction between the two bits of the Bible.
It really is. And I think there's a lot that's uncomfortable about this, particularly with the sort of the history of Christian anti-Semitism and the problems in biblical interpretation where the Old Testament is surpassed, not just fulfilled, but superseded by the New Testament, and the characterization of the Old Testament is to do with law and the New Testament is to do with grace. And I think that although when you look back at the sort of discussions about this, you can see the elements of that, why they have come to that conclusion. But actually, I think there's more actually in these pictures which helps us, I think. In the left-hand figure holding the scroll of the law, there's actually a sword as well. Can you see the sword hanging down from the scroll? And that's just making me think of the word of the Lord being sharp, being piercing, and that we actually get in the New Testament description of the word. And actually that these two need to belong together in a sense. The covenant, the law, was an expression of love all the way through Deuteronomy. The commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And when Jesus is asked what's the most important commandment, that's the one he goes to. And so we really do an enormous disservice to the Old Testament to characterize it as overly concentrating on law as opposed to love, rather, as these have been characterized.
So it's kind of, it's giving us something that, it's working in terms of how it's connecting the architectural way in which the windows work. But and maybe it's of its time in the 20s and 30s as well, in terms of some of that interpretation. But then, of course, ahead of us will then come the horrors of the Holocaust and the Shoah, and all that connects some of that theology. So it's really important in a sense to have it and be able to reflect on it and say, there's both something here that we recognise, but something here that we'd want to critique and indeed move on from.
And I think it opens up a whole area of discussion for Christians as to how do we read the Bible, how do we read the whole of the Bible. And I think these reflections on the Old Testament stories that we've seen, we as Christians see Christian symbols in there, little Christian motifs, which the painter may or may not have intended.
Very true.
And actually, we are invited to read Scripture in the light of Christ. In fact, we must read Scripture in the light of Christ.
Absolutely.
But that has to be done with enormous care.
Yes.